It was a bright, warm afternoon in Greenfield Park, a large public space in Maple City. Darren Grant, a tall, composed man in his 40s, sat quietly on a weathered bench, enjoying a rare moment of peace. Darren worked long, stressful hours at the Central Bureau, and Greenfield Park had always been a sanctuary for him. The sun filtered through the trees, casting a soft glow over the green grass. He could hear children laughing in the distance, their voices blending with the rustle of leaves in the light breeze. Darren had brought a book with him, one of his favorite ways to unwind. He was deep into the story, fully immersed in the world the author had created. For a few hours he could forget about the demands of his job and lose himself in the stillness of the park. This was what he loved, being able to read in peace without worrying about anything else. But today wasn't going to be as peaceful as Darren had hoped. On the far side of the park, Officer Bill Matthews was walking his regular patrol route. Bill was a veteran cop who had worked in Maple City for more than 2 decades. He knew every corner of the city, every street, every park. Greenfield Park was part of his beat, and he prided himself on keeping it safe. Bill believed that he could spot trouble before it even started. His instincts had never let him down, or so he thought. As Bill scanned the park, he noticed Darren sitting alone on a bench. The sight gave him pause. He had never seen Darren around here before, and something about the way Darren sat there, so calm, so composed, made Bill suspicious. A black man, sitting alone, reading quietly. It didn't fit the picture in Bill's mind. He couldn't explain why, but his gut told him something was off. Bill stopped walking and stood still, watching Darren from a distance. He muttered under his breath, "Never seen this guy around here before." Darren could feel the weight of someone's gaze on him. He looked up from his book and noticed Bill standing across the park, staring directly at him. Darren was all too familiar with that look. It was the look of suspicion, of someone judging him based solely on his appearance. He'd seen it countless times in his life, and it always came from the same place: prejudice, thinly veiled as concern. But Darren didn't react immediately. Instead, he calmly closed his book, marking the page with his finger. He kept his hands in his lap, making sure they were visible, and looked right back at Bill. Darren had been in situations like this before, and he knew how to handle them. He wasn't going to make the first move. He knew that the officer, whoever he was, would come to him eventually. Bill watched Darren for a few more moments, trying to figure out what was bothering him. There had been reports of recent crimes in the area, and Darren seemed to fit the description of someone the police had been looking for, a vague description, but one that Bill thought matched. His instincts were telling him that something wasn't right about this man, and Bill had learned to trust those instincts. With a decision made, Bill started walking towards Darren, his posture stiffening with every step. He didn't like how Darren had looked at him, steady, unafraid. It was unsettling. Most people, when approached by a police officer, showed some kind of nervousness. But Darren looked calm, almost too calm, and that only made Bill more determined to find out what was going on. When Bill finally reached the bench where Darren was sitting, he tried to keep his tone neutral. "Afternoon," Bill said, his voice polite but with an edge to it. "Good afternoon," Darren replied, his voice calm and even. He didn't move from his seat, keeping his hands resting on the closed book in his lap. Darren could sense the officer's suspicion, but he didn't let it show on his face. Bill nodded slightly, still watching Darren closely. He was fishing for something, anything, that could justify the feeling gnawing at him. "What brings you to the park today?" Bill asked, trying to sound casual, but his eyes flicked from Darren's face to the book, then back to Darren. "I'm just enjoying the nice weather," Darren said smoothly. "It's a beautiful day, so I thought I'd come to the park and read." Bill nodded again, though he wasn't really listening. His mind was still working, trying to figure out why Darren made him uneasy. "You from around here?" Bill asked, pressing further. Darren gave a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around," he replied, his tone measured. He wasn't in the mood to provide more information than necessary. After all, he wasn't doing anything wrong, just sitting in a public park like everyone else. Bill didn't like Darren's answer. It felt too vague, like Darren was avoiding the question. His suspicion grew, and he shifted his weight slightly, adopting a more confrontational stance. "Mind if I see some ID?" Bill asked, his tone more demanding now. Darren knew this was coming. He had been through situations like this before. He also knew his rights. He wasn't required to show ID just because a police officer asked for it, not unless he was being accused of something. But Darren also knew that refusing could escalate the situation, and he wasn't interested in creating more tension. "Am I under arrest?" Darren asked, his voice calm and steady. He kept his eyes on Bill, not looking away. Bill didn't like the question. It was direct, and there was something about Darren's calmness that irritated him. Darren didn't seem intimidated, and that made Bill feel like he was losing control of the situation. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Bill snapped, his hand moving towards his holster. Darren took a slow breath, keeping his expression neutral. He could feel the tension rising, but he wasn't going to let it get to him. "I'm just sitting in a park," Darren said quietly. "Is that a crime?" Bill's patience was running out. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, though even he knew how weak that excuse sounded. Still, he stepped closer, trying to impose his authority. Darren stayed where he was, meeting Bill's gaze without flinching. "What description is that?" Darren asked, his voice even softer now. Bill's jaw tightened. He didn't have a good answer to that question, and he knew it. But his pride wouldn't let him admit that he was wrong. "Don't get smart with me," Bill said harshly. "Show me some ID, now." For a brief moment, the two men locked eyes. The tension between them thickened. Darren knew he had the right to refuse, but he also knew that doing so could make the situation worse. After a long pause, Darren decided to comply. Without a word, he reached into his pocket slowly and pulled out his wallet. He handed his ID to Bill, who snatched it out of his hand without hesitation. Bill glanced at the ID, but the name didn't mean anything to him. He didn't recognize who Darren was, but that didn't matter. Bill had already made up his mind. "Stand up," Bill ordered, stepping back slightly to give Darren room to rise. Darren sighed inwardly, but he stood up slowly, making sure to keep his hands visible at all times. He knew the routine. He had been through this before. He wasn't going to give Bill any reason to escalate things further. "Turn around," Bill said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Darren felt a wave of frustration rise in him, but he pushed it down. He didn't resist as Bill cuffed his hands behind his back. He could feel the eyes of people in the park watching the scene unfold, but he remained calm. He knew that reacting with anger wouldn't help him now. Bill tightened the handcuffs around Darren's wrists. As he did so, he felt a flicker of doubt. Something about this didn't feel right, but Bill's pride wouldn't let him admit that he might have made a mistake. He grabbed Darren's arm and started leading him toward the patrol car that was parked nearby. Darren didn't say a word as Bill led him away. He wasn't worried about what was happening. He knew who he was, and he knew that this officer would find out soon enough. But as they walked towards the car, Darren felt a deep weariness settle over him. No matter what he had accomplished in life, no matter his success, moments like these reminded him that some people still only saw him as a black man sitting in a park, someone who didn't belong. When they reached the car, Bill opened the back door and guided Darren inside. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Darren's wrists as he sat down. Darren stared out of the window as the car pulled away from the park, watching the trees blur by. He couldn't help but wonder how a simple day in the park had gone so wrong. As Officer Bill Matthews drove Darren Grant toward the police station, his mind was racing. Bill's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he processed what had just happened. He didn't like how Darren had looked at him back in the park. Calm, unafraid. It had unnerved him. Bill had always trusted his instincts, but something about this arrest was bothering him. Still, his pride wouldn't let him admit that he might have been wrong. In the back seat, Darren sat quietly, his hands, cuffed behind him. The city streets flew by, but Darren wasn't paying attention to the passing scenery. His mind was already on what would happen next. He knew the system well enough to know that things could escalate quickly if he wasn't careful. But Darren wasn't worried. He knew his own power. He was an FBI agent, a fact that Officer Matthews had no idea about. As they neared the police station, Bill glanced at Darren in the rearview mirror. "What were you really doing in that park?" Bill asked, suspicion edging his voice. Darren met Bill's eyes in the mirror. His expression was unreadable. "I told you," Darren replied calmly. "I was just reading." Bill scoffed, disbelief clear in his voice. "A guy like you just sitting around reading? You expect me to believe that?" Darren raised an eyebrow. "A guy like me?" he repeated, his tone cool and controlled. Bill hesitated, realizing his slip. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "You don't look like someone who spends their afternoons reading in the park," he said, trying to justify his actions. Darren didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, the tension in the car thickening. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "And what does someone like me look like, officer?" Bill didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew what he had implied, and he knew how it sounded. But admitting that would mean facing something deeper within himself, something he wasn't ready to confront. So he focused on driving, his frustration building as Darren's calm demeanor continued to unsettle him. They arrived at the police station, and Bill parked near the entrance. He got out of the car first, then opened the back door to help Darren out. The handcuffs still bit into Darren's wrists as they walked toward the building. Bill's mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. This arrest wasn't going as he had expected. Darren was supposed to be scared, compliant, not composed and challenging him with every word. Inside the police station, the usual buzz of activity filled the air. Officers filing reports, phones ringing, and conversations humming in the background. Bill led Darren through the main hall, ignoring the curious glances from other officers. He didn't want to explain himself just yet, not until he knew what his next move would be. They reached the booking area, where Officer Sam Jenkins sat behind the desk. Jenkins was a younger officer, still learning the ropes, but he had already gained a reputation for being thorough. "What's going on here?" Jenkins asked, his eyes flicking between Bill and Darren. "Caught this guy acting suspicious in the park," Bill replied. His tone clipped as he handed Darren's ID over to Jenkins. Jenkins took the ID and glanced at it. He froze for a moment, his eyes widening slightly as recognition flashed across his face. But Jenkins quickly masked his reaction, nodding as he typed into the computer. Darren noticed the hesitation and filed it away in his mind. Someone in this station knew who he was. "Captain Morgan is in her office," Jenkins said, handing the ID back to Bill. "You'll need to take him to her." Bill stiffened at the mention of Captain Helen Morgan. She was known for being tough but fair, a stickler for procedure. He hadn't planned on involving her so soon, but now it seemed like he didn't have a choice. "All right," Bill muttered, his voice tight. He grabbed Darren's arm and led him down the hall toward Captain Morgan's office. As they approached the door, Bill could feel the tension rising inside him. He knocked on the door, waiting for Captain Morgan to respond. "Come in," Captain Helen Morgan's voice called from the other side. Bill opened the door and led Darren inside. Captain Morgan, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her paperwork as they entered. Her office was neat and organized, with files and books lining the shelves. "Officer Matthews," Captain Morgan said, her tone neutral. "What's this about?" Bill stepped forward, guiding Darren into the room. "Caught this guy acting suspicious in the park, Captain," Bill said. "He wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID, so I brought him in." Captain Morgan's eyes shifted from Bill to Darren. There was a brief flicker of recognition, but she quickly masked it, her face remaining professional. "Is that so?" she asked, her voice calm and controlled. Darren met her eyes, knowing that Captain Morgan recognized him. He could tell by the look on her face that she knew exactly who he was. But Captain Morgan was playing it carefully, waiting to see how Bill would handle the situation. "That's right," Bill continued, oblivious to the silent exchange between Darren and Morgan. "I brought him in for questioning." Captain Morgan nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Bill. "And did you have probable cause to arrest him?" Bill hesitated. The question caught him off guard. "He wouldn't cooperate, Captain," Bill repeated, though his voice lacked the same confidence it had earlier. Captain Morgan leaned back in her chair, studying Bill carefully. "Officer Matthews, why don't you step outside for a moment? I'd like to speak with Mr. Grant alone." Bill blinked in surprise. "But Captain—" "Outside, officer," Captain Morgan said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Bill nodded and left the room, closing the door behind him. As soon as Bill was gone, Captain Morgan's demeanor softened slightly. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice calm. "I apologize for this misunderstanding." Darren allowed himself a small smile. "No need to apologize, Captain. You're just doing your job." Captain Morgan sighed, glancing at the closed door. "I'm aware of who you are, but I'd appreciate it if we kept that under wraps for now. I need to handle this situation carefully." Darren nodded. "Of course. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to make sure things are handled properly." Captain Morgan nodded in appreciation. "Thank you. I'll speak with Officer Matthews and deal with this appropriately. But I have to ask, why didn't you just tell him who you are?" Darren's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "Because it shouldn't matter, Captain. My identity shouldn't be the reason he decides to treat me with respect." Captain Morgan considered his words, then nodded in understanding. "You're right. It shouldn't matter. But unfortunately, it does to some people." There was a heavy silence in the room, as both Darren and Captain Morgan considered the weight of what had just happened. After a moment, Captain Morgan stood up. "I'll call Officer Matthews back in, and we'll resolve this." Darren nodded again, watching as Captain Morgan moved to the door. The confrontation wasn't over yet, but Darren knew he had the upper hand now. The truth would come out soon enough, and Officer Bill Matthews would have to face the consequences of his actions. Captain Morgan opened the door, and Bill stepped back inside, his expression wary. He could sense that something had shifted, but he didn't know what. He glanced at Darren, who stood calmly, waiting. "Mr. Grant here is not the man you were looking for," Captain Morgan said firmly. "You'll release him immediately." Bill blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. "But Captain—" "Immediately, officer," Captain Morgan repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Bill hesitated, then finally reached for the keys to unlock Darren's handcuffs. His hands shook slightly as the reality of his mistake began to settle in. As the cuffs clicked open, Darren rubbed his wrists, giving Bill a measured look. "Thank you, officer," Darren said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of finality. Bill swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "You're free to go," he muttered, stepping back. Darren nodded and turned to Captain Morgan. "I'll be in touch, Captain," he said quietly. "There's still a lot to discuss." Captain Morgan nodded in return, understanding the weight behind his words. "I look forward to it, Mr. Grant." With that, Darren walked out of the office, leaving Bill standing there, a sinking feeling in his gut. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were only beginning.